A war started. An entire country changed hands, and all of it was over before you could finish watching a single cartoon episode. 38 minutes. That's the total length of the shortest war ever recorded in world history. And we're not talking about some minor skirmish, forgotten in a footnote. We're talking about real warships, real cannons, an entire palace reduced to rubble, hundreds of dead and wounded, and a ruler who took the throne and was knocked off it before his breakfast got cold. And the strangest detail of all, one side didn't even believe it was going to turn into a real war until the first shots started falling. We grow up hearing about wars that lasted years, decades sometimes. Wars that consumed entire generations, that redrew borders on the map, that killed millions of people over months and months of fighting. So it's hard to believe when someone says there was an official war, recognized by history books and even world records, that lasted less time than it takes most people to shower in the morning. But it happened. In 1896, on a small island off the east coast of Africa called Zanzibar, an armed conflict between the British Empire and the local sultanate began at 9 o'clock in the morning, and by around 9:40, it was already over, with an entire country under new command. This isn't a joke, nor one of those exaggerated stories that circulate online with no real basis. It's documented in official reports from the British Royal Navy, in telegrams exchanged between London and the island, in accounts from journalists who were present at the time, and it's still recognized today by official world record registries as the shortest armed conflict ever documented in history. And as you'll see, the reason it all happened so fast wasn't a lack of will to fight. It was an almost perfect combination of a ruler who bet wrong, an empire that wasn't remotely willing to negotiate, and such a massive technological gap between the two sides that the outcome, in hindsight, was practically decided before the first shot was even fired. Today, I'm going to tell you this story from beginning to end, minute by minute, how it began with the suspicious death of a ruler, how a man declared himself sultan without anyone's authorization and bet that the British were bluffing, how English warships positioned themselves in the harbor while telegrams crossed the ocean to London asking for permission to fire, and how in under 40 minutes, an entire palace turned to rubble. A man fled out the back door, and history recorded the shortest conflict humanity had ever seen. And as you'll see, the reason it all happened so fast wasn't a lack of will to fight. It was an almost perfect combination of a ruler who bet wrong, an empire that wasn't remotely willing to negotiate, and such a massive technological gap between the two sides that the outcome, in hindsight, was practically decided before the first shot was even fired. Today, I'm going to tell you this story from beginning to end, minute by minute, how it began with the suspicious death of a ruler, how a man declared himself sultan without anyone's authorization and bet that the British were bluffing, how English warships positioned themselves in the harbor while telegrams crossed the ocean to London asking for permission to fire, and how in under 40 minutes, an entire palace turned to rubble. A man fled out the back door, and history recorded the shortest conflict humanity has ever seen. We grow up hearing about wars that lasted years, decades sometimes. Wars that consumed entire generations, that redrew borders on the map, that killed millions of people over months and months of fighting. So it's hard to believe when someone says there was an official war, recognized by history books and even world records, that lasted less time than it takes most people to shower in the morning. But it happened. In 1896, on a small island off the east coast of Africa called Zanzibar, an armed conflict between the British Empire and the local sultanate began at 9 o'clock in the morning, and by around 9:40, it was already over, with an entire country under new command. This isn't a joke, nor one of those exaggerated stories that circulate online with no real basis. It's documented in official reports from the British Royal Navy, in telegrams exchanged between London and the island, in accounts from journalists who were present at the time, and it's still recognized today by official world record registries as the shortest armed conflict ever documented in history. And as you'll see, the reason it all happened so fast wasn't a lack of will to fight. It was an almost perfect combination of a ruler who bet wrong, an empire that wasn't remotely willing to negotiate, and such a massive technological gap between the two sides that the outcome, in hindsight, was practically decided before the first shot was even fired. Today, I'm going to tell you this story from beginning to end, minute by minute, how it began with the suspicious death of a ruler, how a man declared himself sultan without anyone's authorization and bet that the British were bluffing, how English warships positioned themselves in the harbor while telegrams crossed the ocean to London asking for permission to fire, and how, in under 40 minutes, an entire palace turned to rubble. A man fled out the back door, and history recorded the shortest conflict humanity has ever seen. To understand how a war can last less time than a soap opera episode, we first need to understand what Zanzibar was like at the end of the 19th century, and why that little piece of land in the Indian Ocean mattered so much to the British Empire. Zanzibar was not just any place. It was a small archipelago off the coast of East Africa. But for centuries, it had been one of the most important ports in the entire region, controlling trade routes for spices like clove and cinnamon, and also, in a much darker way, controlling one of the largest slave trade routes on the entire African continent. For much of the 19th century, Zanzibar was ruled by sultans descended from a line originating in Oman in the Middle East, who had built there a small but extremely wealthy center of power, with an imposing palace on the coast facing the sea, surrounded by other government buildings, including one known as the House of Wonders, which at the time was considered one of the most modern and advanced buildings in all of East Africa, even being one of the first buildings in the region to have electricity and an elevator. However, throughout the 19th century, the great European powers gradually expanded their influence over nearly the entire African continent in a process that became known as the Scramble for Africa. And Zanzibar, despite never having been officially colonized in the traditional sense, kept losing real autonomy until it officially became a British protectorate in 1890. On paper, this meant the Sultan remained on the throne, the Sultanate's flag kept flying, the local government kept existing. But in practice, Britain was really in charge through a British consul based on the island itself, who had veto power over practically any important decision made by Zanzibar's government, including, and this detail is essential to understanding this whole story, who could or could not become the next sultan. It was an arrangement formalized through treaties signed between Britain and other European powers, mainly Germany, which also had interests in the region and controlled what is now mainland Tanzania. Under these agreements, any new sultan of Zanzibar had to get approval from the British consul before taking the throne. This wasn't a suggestion or a polite formality. It was a condition written into international treaty. If anyone tried to take the throne without that approval, Britain officially had the right to consider that sufficient grounds for military intervention. Keep that detail in mind, because it's the central piece of everything that follows. It's worth pausing a bit longer on this backdrop, because without understanding the real scale of Zanzibar's wealth and importance during that period, it's hard to grasp why the British Empire cared so much about exactly who sat on that throne. Zanzibar wasn't a poor or isolated island. It was, in practice, one of the busiest commercial centers on the entire east coast of Africa, a meeting point for Arab, Indian, European, and African traders, all passing through to trade clove, ivory, textiles, and, for a long time, enslaved people. Zanzibar's port received ships from as far away as India and the Persian Gulf, and the main city, known as Stone Town, had narrow streets full of markets, mosques, wealthy merchants' houses, and a palace that sat literally facing the sea, like a showcase of the Sultanate's power for any ship arriving. Walking those streets back then meant bumping into merchants shouting prices in several different languages, smelling the strong scent of spices drying in the sun, and seeing, mixed into the crowd, people from completely different backgrounds, coming from 3 continents, all there because of the trade that made that small island one of the richest and most strategically important places on the entire African coast. This wealth also explains why the slave trade was so economically important to the local elite, especially to the royal family and the Arab aristocracy that had ruled the government for generations. And it also explains why, when Britain began pushing harder and harder for an end to that practice over the second half of the 19th century, it wasn't received as a simple administrative adjustment. Much of the local elite received it as a direct attack on the very economic base that had sustained their power for decades. So when we talk about tension between Zanzibar and Britain in the years leading up to 1896, we're not just talking about a formality over who signs what paper. We're talking about years of built-up resentment, a local elite that increasingly saw the British presence as a direct threat to their own way of life, and a British government that, at the same time, saw itself as the protagonist of a kind of moral mission, while also aggressively expanding its own commercial and strategic influence in the region. This whole backdrop matters because it explains why the 1896 succession crisis was in no way an isolated problem. It was just another chapter, maybe the most dramatic one, in a tension that had already been building for years between 2 completely different views of who should really control Zanzibar's fate. In 1893, the Sultan then ruling Zanzibar died, and a young prince named Khalid bin Bargash quickly tried to take the throne without waiting for formal British approval. At the time, the British representative managed to convince him to back down, explaining, with a mix of diplomacy and veiled threat, that this kind of hasty move wasn't going to end well for him. Khalid backed off, and the throne ended up going to another family member, a man named Hamid bin Thwani, who ruled Zanzibar peacefully and cooperatively, exactly the way the British liked, for a little over 3 years. But on August 25, 1896, Sultan Hamid suddenly died inside the palace itself, without warning, with no known illness, in a way that several people at the time already suspected was too convenient to be a coincidence. Historians still believe today there's a real possibility of poisoning, and the main suspect, then and now, is precisely that same prince who had tried to take the throne 3 years earlier, Khalid bin Bargash. And this is where the story starts to accelerate in an almost absurd way, because within a few hours of Sultan Hamad's death being announced, before official mourning had even really begun, Khalid had already moved into the palace complex and declared himself the new Sultan of Zanzibar, without waiting for British approval, without following the protocol he himself had already been warned years before that he needed to follow. The British consul responsible for Zanzibar at that moment was named Basil Cave, and together with a British general commanding the local armed forces, a man named Lloyd Matthews, he immediately warned Khalid that this move was a clear violation of existing agreements and that he needed to back down before the situation spiraled out of control. Khalid ignored the warning. Those two names, Cave and Matthews, are worth remembering because they'll come up repeatedly throughout this story. Basil Cave was a career diplomat, the kind of British civil servant who spent years and years being transferred from one colonial post to another, building up experience handling exactly this type of succession crisis and local power struggle, which was extremely common in various parts of the British Empire during that period. Lloyd Matthews, on the other hand, held an even more peculiar position. He was a British officer, but he had worked directly for Zanzibar's government for years, commanding the local armed forces loyal to the Sultanate, in a role that mixed nominal loyalty to the Sultan with a deep ongoing connection to British interests. It was exactly this kind of arrangement, British officers holding command positions within formerly local government structures, that characterized how this protectorate system actually worked in practice. Power looked local on the outside, but was in essence controlled from within. It's important to understand just how fast all of this happened. We're talking about hours, not days. Sultan Hamad died in the morning, and before the sun had even set that same day, Khalid was already installed inside the palace, had already declared himself Sultan, and was already receiving the first formal warnings that this was unacceptable. There was no mourning period, no calm moment of negotiation between the families involved. It was a race against the clock from the very first minute. And all of that urgency, that desperation on Khalid's part to occupy the throne before anything else could happen, is one of the reasons that reinforce the theory that Sultan Hamad's death wasn't natural. If Khalid really had poisoned his own cousin, it would make perfect sense that he'd already have a plan ready to act immediately, leaving no time for anyone else to organize or react. Instead of backing down, he did the opposite. He started gathering supporters inside and around the palace complex, made up of the main palace itself, an adjoining harem known as Beit al-Hukam, and the already mentioned House of Wonders. Within a few hours, what had been a simple diplomatic disagreement was rapidly turning into an armed mobilization, with hundreds of people gathering inside and around the complex, including the palace guard soldiers, armed slaves, sympathetic civilians, and a considerable amount of weaponry, including old rifles, muskets, and even artillery pieces, many of them, almost ironically, diplomatic gifts the Sultanate itself had received from foreign powers over the years, including from Britain itself. Some historians estimate that at the peak of the mobilization, Khalid had between 2,800 and 3,000 people around him inside and around the palace complex, several hundred of them actually armed and prepared to fight if the British tried to remove him by force. To help you picture the scene, imagine a complex of buildings, practically glued to the sea, with the main palace at the center, the harem right next to it, connected by a covered passage, and the House of Wonders a bit further off, with its imposing facade of iron balconies and carved wood, at the time considered a symbol of modernity and power. All of this sat just a few meters from the waterline, practically at the edge of the harbor, which meant any ship anchored out front had a completely clear line of sight and fire, with no natural obstacle, hill, or distance to offer any protection. It was, without exaggeration, a perfect target for a naval bombardment, and that would become extremely relevant just a few hours later. The House of Wonders, in particular, carried enormous symbolic weight for the local population. It had been built just a few years earlier, commissioned by a previous sultan, specifically to impress foreign visitors and reinforce an image of modernity and strength for the sultanate, at a time when practically every ruler in the region felt pressure to appear advanced enough to be taken seriously by the European powers. Watching that same building, a symbol of pride and modernity, get destroyed by cannons fired from ships of the very power Zanzibar had tried so hard to impress is one of the most heavily ironic details in this whole story.
On the other side, the British had a logistics and diplomatic protocol problem that today seems almost comically bureaucratic. Consul Cave knew the situation called for a strong response, possibly a military one, but he didn't have the authority on his own to simply open fire on a palace. That would require direct authorization from the British government in London, which meant sending a telegram across thousands of kilometers of undersea cable and waiting for a reply, with no way of knowing how long that would take, while the situation in Zanzibar grew more tense with every passing hour. To understand how tense that kind of waiting was, it's worth remembering that in 1896, communication between Zanzibar and London wasn't instantaneous the way it would be today. Undersea telegraph cables connected much of the world colonized by the European powers, which was already a huge advance compared to earlier decades, when a message like that would take weeks or months to arrive by ship. But even so, the process involved several steps. The message had to be encoded, transmitted through different relay stations spread along the cable route, decoded on the other end, physically delivered to the responsible person within the Foreign Office, analyzed, discussed internally by British authorities, and only then answered through the same process back the other way. A simple request for authorization could realistically take anywhere from a full day to several days to get a response, depending on urgency and on the availability of the right people in London to make that decision. That's exactly what he did. Late in the afternoon of August 25th, the same day Sultan Hamad died, Cave sent a telegram to the British Foreign Office in London, asking directly whether he was authorized to open fire on the palace should all attempts at a peaceful solution fail, and then began a tense wait, which would last nearly a full day, while British warships gathered in Zanzibar's harbor one by one, and while Khalid, inside the palace, kept gathering supporters and weapons, apparently confident the British would never actually have the nerve to fire on him. Let's take a closer look at what was really at stake here, and why this dispute wasn't just about wounded pride or an overly ambitious prince. For the British, the issue went far beyond simply choosing who would be the next sultan of Zanzibar. Khalid represented a real strategic risk. There was genuine concern within the British government that he might grow closer to Germany, the other major European power with interests in the region, controlling the mainland territory right next door. If Khalid managed to secure the throne and started building closer ties with the Germans, that could throw off the entire division of influence that Britain and Germany had carefully negotiated between themselves years earlier through treaties that divided nearly all of East Africa into exclusive spheres of influence for each power. Beyond that, there was another, even more delicate issue: the slave trade. Zanzibar had been, for decades, one of the largest slave trading centers in the world, and Britain, especially from the second half of the 19th century onward, had taken a firm public stance against the practice, even forcing previous sultans, through threats and ultimatums, to sign agreements gradually abolishing the slave trade in the region. Khalid and the groups backing him, mainly more traditional and conservative members of the local Arab elite, represented precisely the faction resisting these externally imposed changes, and who saw growing British interference as a direct threat to their way of life and economic interests. So when Khalid declared himself sultan without authorization, he wasn't just committing a breach of protocol. In the eyes of the British government, he was becoming a symbol of resistance against the entire structure of control that Britain had carefully built over the years in that region. And symbols of resistance, from the point of view of any imperial power, are dangerous things to leave unanswered. There's another point that almost never comes up when this story is told quickly, but that makes all the difference in understanding the British urgency. The entire protectorate system Britain had set up in various parts of the world depended, basically, on convincing local rulers and populations that resistance was pointless. It wasn't a system held up by brute military force alone, if only because Britain didn't have enough soldiers spread around the world to physically control every territory under its influence. It was a system sustained in large part by reputation, by the idea that challenging Britain simply wasn't worth it, because the response would be fast, overwhelming, and without hesitation. If Khalid managed to stay on the throne for a few more days, even without winning any direct confrontation, that alone would already be a very serious problem for that reputation. Other territories under British influence elsewhere in the world would be watching how this crisis played out, and a weak or hesitant response in Zanzibar could, in the minds of strategists in London, encourage similar movements elsewhere. That's exactly why a fast, overwhelming response made so much sense from the British point of view, even though the cost in lives on Khalid's side was disproportionate to the actual size of the threat he posed. On August 26th, the second day of the crisis, things started moving faster. In the morning, a British warship called HMS Raccoon arrived in Zanzibar's harbor and took up position alongside two smaller ships already there, HMS Thrush and HMS Sparrow, forming a small line of ships facing the palace complex. Early in the afternoon, an even larger, more important ship arrived, HMS St. George, a cruiser that served as the flagship of the entire British squadron responsible for the region, and aboard it was a high-ranking officer named Harry Rawson, a rear admiral, who from that moment took overall command of the entire British military operation. While the ships took up position, Consul Cave kept trying to negotiate directly with Khalid, sending messengers and notes asking once again that he leave the palace and recognize the candidate the British preferred, another member of the royal family named Hamoud bin Muhammad, considered by London to be a far more cooperative ruler, much more willing to follow the protectorate's rules. Khalid refused repeatedly. In one exchange recorded at the time, he even sent word that he had no intention of lowering his flag and that he didn't believe the British would really open fire on him. Cave replied directly that no one wanted it to come to that, but that if Khalid didn't do what was being asked, they would certainly fire. That specific detail, the fact that Khalid simply didn't believe it would turn into a real shootout, is perhaps the most important detail in this whole story, because it was exactly that wrong bet that turned what could have been just another diplomatic crisis resolved with paperwork into a real military confrontation, with dead, wounded, and a destroyed palace. And it's understandable, to a point, why he thought that way. Over decades of relations between Zanzibar and the European powers, most disputes had been resolved through diplomatic pressure, threats, trade embargoes, tough speeches followed by both sides quietly backing down. Khalid was probably used to seeing that kind of political theater, that game of threats that almost never actually turned into open violence. The problem was that he was reading the situation wrong. Unlike previous crises, this time there was direct authorization from London. There were modern warships already positioned and ready, and there was a rear admiral in command who had absolutely no intention of softening an ultimatum he himself had formalized. Late in the afternoon of that same day, August 26th, London's reply finally arrived for the telegram Cave had sent the day before. Summed up, the message authorized Cave and Rear Admiral Rawson to take whatever measures they considered necessary to resolve the situation, with the full backing of the British government, but urged caution against taking any action they weren't certain they could see through successfully. In other words, you have a green light, but don't do this halfway. With that authorization in hand, Rawson and Cave decided to give Khalid one final deadline. They formalized a clear ultimatum. He had to lower the palace flag and abandon the complex by 9 o'clock the following morning, August 27th. If he failed to do so, the British ships would open fire directly on the palace. That night, the mood in Zanzibar became, according to accounts from those who were there, absolutely suffocating. The merchant ships normally anchored in the harbor were moved away for safety. British women and children living on the island were taken aboard HMS St. George and another civilian ship as a precaution. One of the diplomats present at the time, a man named Mohan, later wrote that the silence hanging over Zanzibar that night was, in his words, almost frightening. Inside the palace, Khalid kept gathering men, handing out weapons, positioning the few artillery pieces he had available facing the harbor where the British ship sat anchored, ready, waiting for dawn.
Picture that moment for a second, an entire city practically frozen, knowing something big was about to happen, but not knowing exactly when or exactly how violent it would be. Merchants closing their shops early, families locked inside their homes, the few foreigners still left on the island wondering whether they should leave the city or just wait to see what would happen. And across the bay, British sailors checking over the ship's cannons, calibrating distances, technically preparing for an attack that, as far as they knew, could be called off at any moment if Khalid simply decided to back down before dawn. Let's pause for a second to understand exactly who was on each side of this dispute, because the difference between the two forces helps explain everything that happened afterward. On Khalid's side, inside and around the palace complex, between 2,800 and 3,000 people had gathered, an impressive number, but made up largely of sympathetic civilians, servants, harem members, and support staff with no real military training. The actually armed and trained portion of that group, made up mainly of the palace guard soldiers under the command of a captain named Salah, numbered around 700 to 900 men, equipped mostly with old rifles, some of them decades out of date, plus a handful of artillery pieces set up haphazardly, many of them, as already mentioned, diplomatic gifts received over the years and never meant to actually be used in combat. Khalid also had, anchored close to the palace, the Sultanate's royal yacht, a small vessel called the Glasgow, fitted with a single, fairly modest cannon.
It's also worth noting the strange, complicated position of the nearly 900 Askari soldiers fighting on the British side that day. They were local soldiers, African and Arab, recruited and trained within the Protectorate's own military structure, technically serving Zanzibar's government, but in practice following orders from British commanders like General Matthews. On the day of the battle, these soldiers found themselves, one way or another, fighting against other subjects of the same sultanate, some of them possibly even acquainted with or distant relatives of people who were inside the palace defending Khalid. It's a reminder of how this kind of colonial conflict was rarely a clean fight between two clearly defined sides. Most of the time, it was an entire population split apart, pushed to opposing sides by decisions made far above their heads, in offices in London and Berlin, with most of the people involved having no real power to choose which side of history they'd end up on. On the British side, the force gathered in the harbor included 5 warships, the already mentioned HMS St. George serving as the flagship under Rawson's direct command, HMS Philomel, and 3 smaller gunboats, HMS Raccoon, HMS Thrush, and HMS Sparrow. Aboard those ships were about 150 British Marines and sailors, plus modern naval artillery, far more advanced than anything Khalid had available inside the palace. On addition to that naval force, the British also had the support of nearly 900 local soldiers, known as Askaris, loyal to the Protectorate government and commanded by General Lloyd Matthews, the same officer who had already tried to warn Khalid days earlier about the consequences of his actions. In other words, even though the raw number of people was fairly similar on both sides, the gap in technology and training was brutal. On one side, modern naval cannons, firing high-explosive shells, operated by professional crews trained specifically for naval combat. On the other side, outdated rifles, old artillery pieces, many of them never even tested in real combat, and a defending force made up largely of people with no real military experience at all. It's worth quickly explaining why this technological gap was so glaring. At the end of the 19th century, the Royal Navy was, without exaggeration, the most advanced and powerful naval force on the entire planet. The ships anchored off Zanzibar that day weren't improvised vessels or old, outdated warships.
ships. They were relatively modern cruisers and gunboats for the time, equipped with cannons capable of firing explosive shells over considerable distances, with far greater accuracy than anything that had existed decades earlier. On top of that, the crews aboard those ships went through constant training, regular artillery drills, and operated within an extremely organized command structure with experienced officers coordinating every shot. It was, in short, an extremely well-oiled war machine, built and refined over decades to project British military power to any corner of the world with enough water to float a ship. On Khalid's side, the reality was completely different. Much of the weaponry available inside the palace, including several of the artillery pieces, was decades old, some of the cannons dating back to much earlier periods, given or sold to the sultanate over the years by different foreign powers, often as symbolic diplomatic gestures, with no real expectation that those pieces would ever be used in direct combat against the very power that had given them. The men operating those pieces weren't professional artillerymen trained specifically for this kind of combat. Most of them were palace guards, with some basic notion of how to operate firearms, but with absolutely no real experience in naval combat or in facing a coordinated bombardment coming from multiple ships at once. At dawn on August 27, 1896, the ultimatum's deadline began closing in fast. At 8 o'clock in the morning, according to some accounts, or closer to 9 according to others, one last formal warning was sent to Khalid, telling him very little time remained before the British ships would open fire. Khalid, once again, chose not to back down. He stayed inside the palace, surrounded by his armed supporters, apparently still convinced the whole thing was nothing more than an elaborate bluff. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the ultimatum's deadline officially expired. On the ships, the gun crews were already in position, cannons loaded and aimed directly at the palace complex, waiting only for Rear Admiral Rawson's final order. Inside the palace, despite all the confidence Khalid had shown in the previous days, tension was certainly starting to set in, because the ships just sat there, motionless, silent, showing no sign of backing off. And it was at exactly this moment that the shortest war in human history truly began. To really grasp what that means, we're talking about an average of more than 12 artillery shells fired per minute, not even counting the thousands of machine gun and rifle bursts fired at the same time. This wasn't sporadic gunfire with pauses between shots. It was a continuous, almost uninterrupted bombardment designed specifically to give the defenders no chance to regroup or attempt any kind of coordinated resistance. Witnesses in the city described a cloud of dust and smoke that quickly covered the whole palace area, making it nearly impossible, even for those watching from a distance, to make out exactly what was happening inside. Inside the palace complex, chaos was instant. According to historical accounts, within the first 2 minutes of the bombardment, realizing the situation was completely untenable and that the palace had no way of withstanding that kind of attack, Khalid bin Bargash fled out the back of the complex, abandoning his own supporters inside the building, which continued to be bombarded. He left behind hundreds of people, many of them civilians, servants, and harem members with no military preparation whatsoever, trapped inside a structure that kept being torn apart by explosions coming from the sea. It's worth imagining for a moment what must have gone through Khalid's mind in those first seconds. A man who, days before, had spoken with total confidence that the British would never actually fire, now running through the corridors of his own palace, hearing explosions getting closer and closer, watching pieces of the ceiling collapse around him, and making the decision to abandon everything, including the hundreds of people who had gathered there specifically to support his claim to the throne. He managed to get out through an exit at the back of the complex, away from the ship's direct line of fire, and disappeared into the narrow streets of Stone Town, leaving behind a palace in flames and a crowd of supporters with no leadership left to decide what to do next. Meanwhile, the small royal yacht, the Glasgow, tried to fight back, firing its single cannon at the British ships. It was an almost symbolic attempt. HMS St. George, the flagship under Rawson's direct command, responded to the shot almost immediately, hitting the Glasgow with far heavier fire and sinking the small vessel within minutes, without inflicting any significant damage on the British ships. With the defenses destroyed, the leader already fled and hiding somewhere in the city, and the palace building itself on fire and collapsing piece by piece, the resistance inside the complex simply fell apart. British Marines, together with the Askari soldiers loyal to the Protectorate, began advancing toward the complex by land, while the naval bombardment continued from the sea. At around 9:40 in the morning, roughly 38 minutes after the first shot, the firing finally stopped. The flag flying over what remained of the palace, symbol of Khalid's self-proclaimed sovereignty, was pulled down, officially marking the end of the resistance and the total surrender of the forces still inside the complex. When the ground troops finally entered what was left of the complex, they found near total destruction. The House of Wonders, with all its pride at being one of the most modern buildings in the region, had parts seriously damaged by the impacts. The main palace was almost completely destroyed, with the roof collapsed in several places and fires still burning among the rubble. Bodies and wounded were scattered across the inner courtyards and hallways, and survivors, in shock, tried to organize themselves amid the smoke, not knowing for certain whether the bombardment had really ended or could resume at any moment. In under 40 minutes, an entire palace had been reduced to smoking rubble. The result, in terms of lives lost, was brutally lopsided between the two sides. It's estimated that around 500 people on Khalid's side were killed or wounded over those minutes of fighting, most of them palace guard members, servants, and civilians who happened to be inside or around the complex at the moment of the attack. On the British side, the result was almost unbelievable by comparison. Only a single sailor was wounded, hit accidentally, and he would survive and fully recover afterward. Take a moment to think about that number. One side lost, in under 40 minutes, the equivalent of an entire small town's worth of dead and wounded. The other side had exactly one person injured, and not even seriously. This brutal disparity in casualties between the two sides is, to this day, one of the most discussed details among historians who study this conflict, because it illustrates extremely clearly what this kind of confrontation really was between an industrialized empire with modern military technology and a local government that, despite all the courage and determination of its defenders, simply had no real chance of winning. It's also worth remembering that a good part of the 500 people killed or wounded on Khalid's side weren't technically combatants at all. They were palace servants, harem members, curious onlookers who had come near the complex in the preceding days because of all the commotion, and ordinary civilians who simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when the first shells started falling. This is a detail that rarely comes up when this story is told just for the funny side of the number 38 minutes. Behind the historical curiosity, there was a real tragedy, concentrated in a span of time shorter, almost incomprehensibly, than the time it takes most people to watch a single podcast episode.
So, what happened after those 38 minutes that would officially become known as the shortest war ever recorded in human history? Khalid bin Barghash, the man who had started this whole crisis by declaring himself sultan without British authorization, managed to escape the city and made it to the German consulate, where he requested and was granted diplomatic asylum. Since Zanzibar was a British protectorate, but Germany maintained its own diplomatic presence in the region because of the agreements dividing East Africa between the two powers, the German consulate wasn't technically under direct British jurisdiction, which allowed Khalid to stay there protected for a while, despite enormous British pressure for him to be handed over. Shortly after, quietly, he was taken out of Zanzibar by a German ship and brought to German territory on the mainland of East Africa, where he would live in exile for almost 2 decades. His story, in fact, would have a curious, almost poetic final chapter years later. During the First World War, when British forces invaded German territory in East Africa as part of the broader military campaign against Germany, Khalid ended up finally being captured by the very British forces he had fled nearly 20 years earlier in Zanzibar. This time, he wasn't executed or harshly imprisoned. He was allowed to live out his final years in the city of Mombasa, in Kenya, on the condition that he formally renounce any future claim to the throne of Zanzibar, finally closing, decades later, the dispute he had started that morning in August 1896. Meanwhile, back in Zanzibar, on that same day, August 27th, the British formalized the installation of the candidate they had always preferred for the throne, Hamoud bin Mohammed.
Unlike Khalid, Hamoud proved from the start to be an extremely cooperative ruler when it came to British interests, accepting nearly every condition imposed by the protectorate without much resistance. He would rule Zanzibar with steady British backing and no real confrontation until his death a few years later in 1902, after which he was replaced by another family member equally aligned with the protectorate's interests. After 1896, no other claimant to the throne ever tried to repeat what Khalid had done, which, at least from the British point of view, proved exactly what they wanted to prove: that the message had been received loud and clear throughout the region. It was, in fact, during his rule in 1897 that slavery was officially abolished in Zanzibar, formally closing, at least on paper, a dark chapter that had shaped much of the local economy and society for centuries. Although the real transition to freedom for thousands of previously enslaved people was, in practice, much slower and far more complicated than any official decree suggested. From the British point of view, the outcome of the war had been, by practically any practical measure, a complete success. In under an hour, they had removed an unwanted ruler, installed a replacement far more aligned with their own interests, and sent an extremely clear message to anyone else in the region thinking about challenging British authority in the future about exactly what would happen to them. Zanzibar, already a British protectorate on paper, became, in practice, even closer to a full colony in every sense but name, remaining under this kind of direct British control for decades, until finally achieving full independence only in 1963, nearly 70 years after the events we've just described. And here's one last, almost ironic detail to close out this story. Just a few years after independence, in 1964, Zanzibar's monarchy, the same line of sultans dating back decades before that 38-minute war, was overthrown for good by a popular revolution, which installed a new government, and shortly after, united Zanzibar with the mainland territory of Tanganyika, forming the country we know today as Tanzania. In other words, the throne the British spent an entire morning and a full naval bombardment trying to protect and control ended up being completely extinguished a few decades later anyway, by a movement that had nothing to do with the British at all. There's another interesting detail that usually goes unnoticed in this story, one involving the British officers themselves who took part in the operation. Several of the officers who commanded that bombardment were later decorated and promoted because of their performance in Zanzibar. Rear Admiral Rawson received formal honors from the British government and, years later, even became governor of an entire region in Australia. Consul Basil Cave was also decorated and promoted to an even more important diplomatic post. To them, that 38-minute morning wasn't an uncomfortable tragedy to be forgotten. In the eyes of the British government of the time, it was seen as a success story, a textbook example of how to quickly resolve a colonial crisis without letting the situation drag on for weeks or months. That contrast is, perhaps, one of the most uncomfortable aspects of this whole story when we look at it through today's eyes. On one side, a huge, disproportionate number of dead and wounded, most of them ordinary people who never asked to be caught in the middle of a power struggle between an ambitious prince and an empire that wouldn't tolerate challenges. On the other side, promotions, medals, and titles handed out to precisely the people who commanded that bombardment. It's this kind of contrast that turns the Anglo-Zanzibar War from a simple statistical curiosity into a much more complicated, much darker portrait of how colonial power actually worked at the height of the British Empire. Today, the so-called Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896 is officially recognized, including by records like the Guinness World Records, as the shortest armed conflict ever documented in human history. Most of the time, it's told almost like a funny curiosity, one of those strange historical footnotes people share just for the shock value of the number, 38 minutes. But behind that curious number lies a much heavier story about colonial power, about a political gamble that went terribly wrong, and about hundreds of people who died or were wounded defending a palace that in practice never had any real chance of holding out against the force positioned right in front of it, waiting for the clock to strike 9 in the morning. When the news reached London a few days later, through the same telegraph cables that had carried the request for authorization, it was received almost like a small but symbolically satisfying victory. British newspapers of the time covered the episode in a tone that today sounds uncomfortably proud, describing the speed and efficiency of the operation as proof of the empire's military and organizational superiority. In British accounts of the time, there was practically no serious questioning of the proportionality of the response, of the civilian death toll, or of whether that level of force was really necessary to settle a succession dispute. That kind of almost celebratory coverage helps explain why this war has for so long been better known as a statistical curiosity than as the episode of disproportionate violence that, looked at more closely, it clearly was. And maybe that's exactly why this story is still told, more than 120 years later. Not just because of the striking number, not just for the curiosity of imagining an entire war fitting inside the length of a class break, but because it sums up, in an almost textbook way, entirely within 38 minutes, exactly how the world worked back then. A handful of European empires deciding, through treaties signed thousands of kilometers away, who could or couldn't govern entire territories on the other side of the planet, and being fully willing to prove that point with cannons should anyone dare to disagree. There's even an interesting comparison that helps put into perspective just how extreme this case really is. When people think of short wars, they usually remember conflicts that lasted a few days or a few weeks, like certain rapid 20th century confrontations known precisely for how quickly one side overwhelmed the other. But even those examples, already considered extremely short by historical standards, lasted full days, sometimes weeks, involving multiple phases of combat, troop advances, and repositioning. The Anglo-Zanzibar War had none of that. No prolonged territorial advance, no multiple days of fighting, not even enough time for the losing side to organize a second line of defense. From start to finish, it was a single continuous event, packed into less than an hour, the kind of thing you'd normally only imagine happening in a movie, when in reality it happened, word for word, exactly the way historical records describe it. Another comparison worth making is to how much time we tend to spend on everyday things without even noticing. 38 minutes is less time than most movies take to get from the opening credits to the first major plot twist. It's less time than a professional soccer match, not counting halftime. It's less time than a lot of people spend stuck in traffic on the way home from work. And yet, within that same span of time, an entire government was toppled, a historic palace was reduced to rubble, and the fate of an entire country was decided for decades to come. That's why, whenever this war shows up in lists of historical trivia or in videos like this one, it tends to trigger the same reaction of disbelief. People simply can't believe that an official war, with real warships, real deaths, and real political consequences lasting decades, fit into a span of time so short that most people can't even properly recall what they were doing at 9 in the morning on that same day of the week last week. If you want to learn about another war that also changed an entire country in a matter of hours, taking less than a full day to happen, just click the next video right here.